So for your homework, well, your classwork on Monday and for your homework, you read about the North and how the Industrial Revolution affected the North. So in this section, we're going to talk about the South and the plantation South and what came to be called Cotton Kingdom. And especially in this case, what you're looking at is how technology, specifically a few particular innovations, had a huge impact on agriculture and especially on slave labor. If you're wondering why there's two sections devoted to the North and the South, I will help you by telling you that this is all setting up the Civil War. Because of course, the Civil War is about slavery. Some would argue it was about states' rights, but it's also about the fact that these two regions of the country developed completely different economies and thus different values, and that's what then made it possible for them to go to war against each other. So there were two causes, and I would expect you to know them. I would expect me to ask you a Google Classroom question about them. Two reasons why the South turns into what we call Cotton Kingdom. One of them is the Industrial Revolution in the North. Remember, you learned about the Industrial Revolution in the North, and what it did was because it made it possible to turn cotton into thread and to turn thread into cloth much more quickly and allowed them to make more money. They had a higher demand for cotton and they needed those raw materials so they could have more raw materials to turn into those manufactured goods. The other one, and probably the really big one, is a man named Eli Whitney invented something that you can kind of see depicted here called the cotton gin. And the purpose of the cotton gin was to make it much faster to remove the seeds from the cotton, because obviously the cotton couldn't be turned into cloth until the seeds had been removed. So you see here that in one end, the cotton bolls or the pieces of cotton that were pulled off by the slaves are put into the machine. Then through this crank system, they have the seeds pulled out, they're brushed more into clean, and then out of that comes that clean cotton. I'll tell you that a worker working for a day could only do about 1 pound of cotton in a day, whereas you'll see that the cotton gin makes that 50 times faster. So obviously, if you're now able to remove the seeds from the cotton faster and sell more cotton, what you need to do is grow more cotton. And that's why we see the rise of Cotton Kingdom. I do want you to pay attention to the states where this is located. We will consider Missouri, which is a slave state, and Kentucky and Virginia. We'll consider these southern states, but you'll notice that the real home of Cotton Kingdom are these more south states. We've got what they called it the Black Belt, and one of the reasons they do that is because these are the ones that are going to make extensive use of slave labor. So please pay attention to where you're going to see a lot of cotton growth. So I want you to draw some conclusions based on these two graphs. Nearly every textbook puts them side by side so that you will draw one very important conclusion. Pay attention, if you would, to what they're both measuring. Look at the time periods that both of them indicate. And if there's one thing you should take away, really, if there's one thing you have to take away from this section, it's that technological innovations like the cotton gin are a huge part of the reason that slavery is going to grow exponentially. You'll see that in 1800 there's just under 1 million slaves, and by 1860 there are 4 million slaves in America. So the curve on both of them is roughly equivalent. I did want you to see, remember I told you how not all of the states were going to be Cotton Kingdom states and not all of the states were going to be slave states. I do want you to see this. This is from the 1860 census, and it's going to give you by state the free population living there, the slave population living there, the total, and then here's where I really want you to pay attention, the percentage of slaves. So obviously, you do have little Delaware. The rest of these are all of these are going to be northern or southern states. I'm sorry, except for Delaware, and little Delaware does have 1.6%. Slave population. But remember what I told you about those more northern states? Maryland is a more northern southern state. Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Virginia there you can see. These are the ones who aren't going to have as many slaves because they're not growing cotton. The Carolinas are going to be known for cotton, but also for rice, which is another highly intensive, because it's water intensive. So you're going to see that a large number of people are going to be killed by malaria and that kind of disease while they're harvesting it. But this is the heart of Cotton Kingdom here. You should know, though, I put it on its own slide by itself in hopes that you would put a big star next to it. We act as if the South was all about slavery, but less than half of Southerners actually owned slaves. I'll say that again. Less than half of them even owned slaves. The other half were not wealthy enough to own other people. They didn't own these massive plantation houses that are what we think of when we think of the planter South or the Cotton Kingdom. And even of those who did own slaves, most of them owned fewer than 10. So while this is kind of the image we have in our minds, well, this is the image I have in my mind. I don't know what image you have in your mind of the Plantation South, but this is the big house. You've got the idea of the big house where this white family lives in absolute luxury. They have the best of everything. You know that the South isn't known for its public schools. That was the North. But of course, the people living in these luxurious homes are able to afford private tutors, and their children get the best educations. They're waited on, of course, many of them by domestic slaves, so slaves in the house. But at the same time, they also have, of course, their agricultural slaves who are out here breaking their back to some degree in order to harvest that cotton that's going to ultimately make these people rich. But one more time, not everybody owned slaves. Oh, here's that map again. I did want to remind you, think about when you're looking at these northern or southern states, these are going to be small farmers. These are people who raise cows, chickens, people who are even some of them at the subsistence level of just creating enough to subsist or survive. And it's really only down in the Black Belt where you have these real plantations. You don't need to write this down, so if you're listening, don't. But one of the things your book mentions, which I think is interesting, but you probably got from what you did in Miss Robinson's class, slave owners actually defended slavery. And one of the arguments they made was that unlike in the North, and you should remember this from the section you read on your own, 11.2, African Americans were very much discriminated against in the North. They struggled to even find work, and the work that they did have was the most menial or low-level. Hey, that was actually a vocab word. The most menial or low-level work there was. Slave owners argued that at least in the South, all of the African Americans that were slaves had jobs. They didn't have to worry about being unemployed. And while they weren't, paid for their work, at least they had their room and board provided. In fact, they argued that they took care of their slaves because they viewed their slaves as property, and just as you wouldn't destroy as capital, and just as you wouldn't destroy your machine because it had cost you money, you wouldn't destroy your slave either. Obviously, the Northern abolitionists, I hope you remember abolish as in to get rid of, so the abolitionists moved to get rid of slavery, argued that while it may be true that they didn't have the best situation in the North, at least they could quit if they didn't like a job. They weren't subject to the kind of abuse that slaves were at the hands of especially cruel slave owners and especially cruel supervisors. I do want you to know some facts about free African Americans in the South. You might want to do this as a T-chart. In fact, you'd be wise to do this as a T-chart. We're talking about the South now, and I want you to compare and contrast the situations of the free African Americans and the slaves African Americans. So about 6% of the African Americans in the South were freedmen or women, people who were not slaves. They also, just as in the North, were excluded from all but the most low-level basic cleaning low-salary jobs. They were denied rights. They weren't permitted to send their children to school. They weren't permitted to vote or serve on juries. Obviously, they weren't permitted to testify against whites. So if you were an African American who was accused of a crime by a white, you were virtually doomed because you weren't allowed to even take the stand to testify against the whites. Not that the all-white jury would have listened to you anyway. They were discouraged from traveling. Often it would be made extremely difficult for them to get around, and they had to be aware that at any time they might find themselves kidnapped by slave catchers. There were people who made their livelihoods off of catching fugitive slaves, and you'll see this start with the Missouri Compromise. But even free African Americans would find themselves sometimes kidnapped and accused of being an escaped slave. I found this image, this lithograph here. You can see the year on this, 1838. And I found it interesting because what you see here are fugitive slave catchers who have captured this woman who was a freed person who was not a slave. And look at what it says. It says tearing up free papers. So this here is the papers that prove that she is not a slave, that she's in fact a free, I almost said citizen, obviously not a citizen, but that she's in fact a free person. So while this man is capturing her and preparing to sell her into slavery, he looks on and tears up her proof. And they say, in the southern states, every colored person is presumed to be a slave till proven to be free, and they're often robbed of the proof. So that's what's happening there. We talked about the slave codes very early on when we did the regions. We talked about the slave codes. I want to return to that. Here's an image of one of the images of the slave code of Alabama. Take a look at the date on that, 1852. Remember, Alabama's down there in the Black Belt. The slave codes were essentially just a collection of laws, and they differed by state, but there was some common ground. And the purpose of these laws was to control virtually every aspect of slave life. And we'll talk about why they needed that on the next slide. Of course, slaves were treated as property, which made it easier to then just divide families. Children would often be separated from their parents and have only like the vaguest notion of who their parents were. Of course, they were forbidden to carry weapons. That shouldn't surprise you. They were forbidden to learn to read or write, and it was then also, from reading Frederick Douglass, it was often made a crime to teach a slave to read or write. Part of keeping someone in the dark and keeping someone under power is keeping them uneducated. They were also forbidden to meet in groups without a sort of white chaperone doing so, and that was, of course, out of fear that they would plan revolts. And they were, of course, subject to whipping and other brutal punishments, or at least they weren't. Of course, they weren't subject to this from every slave owner, but doing so was not a violation of the law. Two things about which I want you to be aware when it comes to slave life. They found hope in the Bible. Many of them had converted to Christianity. It was, of course, a sort of mixture of African religions that they had brought with them and Christianity, but many of them did convert to Christianity, often because their masters wanted them to. And they sang this particular genre of songs called spirituals. You'll often hear them called Negro spirituals, and we're going to listen to some of them in class. But these are religious sort of folk songs, and they are largely written, because they're written at this time period, they're about what it's like to be a slave or slave life. But this was a source of some hope for African Americans, particularly after 1808, when it becomes illegal to import any new slaves into the United States from Africa. Remember, that was one of the compromises of the Constitutional Convention, was that they would agree not to import new slaves after 1808. Particularly at that point, they have more distance from Africa. There are no longer new influxes of slaves from Africa, but still they have the existing influence. I want you to know about religion and also about resistance. I do want you to know that there were many ways that slaves did attempt to resist slavery and being held captive. Two of the more passive ones, they would often work slowly. Sometimes they would pretend that they didn't know what they were supposed to do in order to avoid doing so. Sometimes they would actually break the equipment that they were working on, but you can imagine, of course, how upsetting that would be to the planter or the slave owner. We call them planters, because that equipment, like the slaves, is their property. It's their means of capital. It's how they make money. There were a couple of rebellions, but the one that we memorize as historians, the one that I want you to memorize, is led by a man named Nat Turner. And Nat Turner led a revolt in 1831. He was a really interesting character. He said that he had a vision from God, like Christian God. He had a vision from God. He'd actually had a series of visions throughout his life. People viewed him as a prophet. He had a vision from God telling him to kill the white people and lead a slave revolt. He killed about 60 whites. He also killed women and children. Part of the criticism of him was that this wasn't just a revolt against the guilty parties. I did air quotes at that time, but in fact it punished innocents as well. Take a look at this political cartoon and take a moment to appreciate how it's propaganda, how it's calculated to prove a point. And we're going to talk more about that in class. As a result of this revolt, ever more harsh slave codes were passed. Whites found themselves in fear of the African Americans who were living, African American slaves who were living amongst them in huge numbers. So they instituted harsher and harsher punishments. And thanks to this revolt, about somewhere upwards of 150 to 200 slaves who were not involved, or African Americans, even freed African Americans who were not even involved in the revolt, were slaughtered. Last thing we need to know about is the West. So here is America as it stands. I want you to notice the division between slave states and free states. And what we have in 1819 is a tie. We have 11 free states and 11 slave states. And this is especially important in the Senate, because in the Senate, there's equal representation. So, of course, each of these states has 2 representatives. So we've got a 22-22 person tie in the Senate. But you've had Missouri, who since 1817 was seeking to be admitted to the Union, and they were a slave state. But the North had obviously fought this because they didn't want that to be out of balance. So a compromise was struck, and nearly all of these compromises that we talk about are going to be largely given credit to Henry Clay. Remember Henry Clay, corrupt bargain Henry Clay, Speaker of the House Henry Clay? He is going to come up with this compromise in 1820 and realize this is before the corrupt bargain. Maine is going to Missouri will be permitted to enter the Union as a slave state, but to offset that or to balance it out, we're also going to have the admission of Maine as a free state. Also, as a result of the Missouri Compromise, this line here, which you'll see called the 3630, the Missouri Compromise line, this is going to identify areas where anywhere north of this is closed to slavery. Any state that wants to come into the Union north of this line is going to be closed to slavery. It's not going to be permitted. But as a kind of a nod to the Southerners, this is going to give explicit legal permission for slave catchers to pursue their fugitives into free territory. So now even if slaves flee above, slaves flee above the 3630 line, slave catchers can go up here to catch them. Now this compromise, as you can imagine, is not going to last forever. It's going to be superseded by another series of compromises, but this is going to solve that problem, at least for the moment in 1820, and allow Missouri to come in. Make sure you write a good summary, and I'll see you in class.